There has been a proposal for a new government of national accord in Libya. The government is supposed to bring together two sides, but at the moment it's a very, very fragile situation that unfortunately has not brought in the requisite amount and the requisite needed amount of trust. And I think ultimately what binds, or the glue that binds these kind of agreements together, is trust. And I think at this very, very moment in time, we have a notion of how we can agree to formulate and calibrate a new government. But underneath this, what they need to find out is, why were the two sides fighting? How can we find a way in which we can de-escalate that language and find a way in which they can begin to trust one another, to say, let's go and build a country together. Otherwise, it could be nothing more than just sitting in the same room and occupying the same ministries. But without that prerequisite level of trust, you cannot end a war. And unless you de-escalate the language, you can't end that war and find a sustainable and meaningful peace. So today could be a moment of extraordinary significance for Libya. It could be a moment that we look to in our history and look to going forward as a moment of the first step towards a new and better Libya, a progressive and more prosperous Libya. It could also be the first of the faltering steps that Libya ends up taking until it begins to understand that unless you speak the language of peace, you can't end war. I think there is a problem with civil society and more broadly in Libya, and I think that they understand. I think most of the Arab Spring terminology, jargon, and the syndrome now has been made to such that not only do the recipients within the society understand that in order to impact and have meaningful political change, they have to organize themselves into groups and organizations that can be a go-between from the governor to the governed. But also the governors, the political parties and the political factions and blocs, they also understand that civic society and the appearance of civic society is a good way of making oneself seem popular. It's a good way of also organizing wars. We've also seen in Libya, in Egypt, in other countries without the Arab world, in North Africa, we've seen that these organizations don't always speak the language of peace. In fact, at moments in time, they're not really a civil society movement, they're actually a social movement. And they have a doctrinal purpose, they have a political partisan idea. And they say that we are the youth, we are the people of Libya, we are the people of Tunis, or we are the people of Egypt. But in reality, they speak for themselves perhaps, and maybe not for everybody else. And most critically here is that they've not been marginalized, far from that. In fact, the main problem with Libya and the main problem with civic society in Libya is that they're not all civic society. And that some of this is artificial. It's been created by political parties to almost smuggle in their political rhetoric, their political goals in the guise of a social movement that is non-partisan, that is fragile, that is innocent, that is a metric of health, but in reality is just another tool in the choreography of war.